In December 2008, the quiet community of Rusk County, East Texas, became the scene of one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's history. 13-month-old Amora Bain Carson, a bright-eyed baby just beginning her life, was found dead inside her family's trailer home. The brutality of her death stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Her mother's boyfriend, 18-year-old Blaine Keith Milam, claimed that he and Jesseca Carson believed the child was possessed by demons. What followed, they said, was an exorcism. But the truth was far darker. Amora's tiny body showed catastrophic injuries, multiple skull fractures, broken bones, internal trauma, and human bite marks. The violence was so severe that doctors couldn't pinpoint a single cause of death, only ruling it homicidal violence. The murder was so senseless, so shocking, that it quickly drew national attention. And at the center of it all was Blaine Milam, a teenager with a troubled past, now branded by prosecutors as a sadistic killer. Convicted of capital murder in 2010, Milam was sentenced to death, beginning a legal battle that would stretch for nearly 15 years. His case raised difficult questions about the use of discredited forensic evidence, the execution of the intellectually disabled, and whether justice could ever be enough for the loss of a child. By 2025, all appeals had failed. Milam's date with death was set. On September 25th, inside the walls of Texas Huntsville unit, he received a lethal injection. Unlike the infamous killers before him, he was not allowed to choose a special last meal. Instead, he ate the standard prison fare, and when given the chance to speak his final words, he looked toward the witnesses and said, "If any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again. I love you all. Bring me home, Jesus." To understand how a young couple's twisted belief in demons ended in the brutal death of a baby girl, and how a man once just 18 years old came to die by lethal injection, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just haunt a family, it haunts all of Texas. Blaine Keith Milam was born on December 12, 1989, in the heart of East Texas, a place where small-town traditions and tight-knit communities defined everyday life. Yet behind that simple backdrop, Blaine's world was far less stable than it appeared. Those who knew him as a child described him as quiet, often withdrawn, a boy who seemed to struggle to find his footing even in the most ordinary settings. And as he grew older, the cracks in his life widened. By his teenage years, he was already drifting toward trouble, brushing against the law with petty offenses, skipping school, and surrounding himself with influences that pulled him further away from any chance of a stable future. But it was in those same turbulent years that Blaine crossed paths with Jesseca Carson, a young woman carrying struggles of her own. And the two quickly became entwined in a volatile relationship that would soon spiral into something darker than either of them could have imagined. By the time Blaine was just 18 years old, instead of focusing on building a future for himself, he was living in a small, cluttered trailer home in Rusk County with Jesseca and her infant daughter, Amora Bain Carson, a fragile little girl who depended on them for care and safety. Yet within that home, the lines between love, responsibility, and destruction were tragically blurred, setting the stage for a crime so violent and senseless that it would forever mark his name in the darkest pages of Texas history. Amora Bain Carson was just 13 months old, a tiny baby with bright eyes and a smile that could soften even the hardest of days, described by family as a joyful, curious child who was only beginning to discover the world around her. And though her life had barely started, those who held her in their arms saw in her the promise of laughter, of first steps, of birthdays yet to come. For Amora's short days were filled with innocence, moments of play, and the unconditional love that every child deserves. Yet behind that fragile beauty and purity lay a fate that no one could have imagined. Because in December of 2008, in the very place where she should have been safest, her own home, Amora would become the focus of a nightmare so brutal, so unimaginable, that even veteran investigators and medical examiners were shaken by what they found, her small body bearing the weight of unspeakable violence. turning what should have been the tender beginnings of childhood into one of the most tragic and haunting cases in Texas history. On the morning of December 2nd, 2008, a frantic 911 call from 18-year-old Blaine Keith Milam summoned authorities to a small trailer home in Rusk County, Texas, where he claimed to have discovered that his girlfriend's 13-month-old daughter, little Amora Bain Carson, was dead. And when officers arrived on the scene, the reality that confronted them was far beyond anything they had imagined. For inside the modest, dimly lit home lay the body of a baby so brutally injured that even hardened. Investigators struggled to process the violence she had endured. Her skull fractured multiple times, her arms, legs, and ribs broken, her liver torn, her tiny frame covered in bruises and lacerations, and her flesh bearing unmistakable human bite marks. The sheer extent of her suffering so catastrophic that the medical examiner later testified it was impossible to name a single cause of death, concluding instead that she had died from homicidal violence due to the overwhelming number of life-threatening injuries. At first, Milam and the child's mother, Jesseca Carson, told police they had left Amora alone for less than an hour and returned to find her lifeless. But as investigators pressed them, their story changed into something even more disturbing, with both insisting they believed the baby was possessed by demons and that what unfolded had been an attempted exorcism meant to drive the evil out. Yet prosecutors, backed by the horrific forensic evidence, made clear to the jury and to the world that this was no act of misguided faith or ritual. It was deliberate, prolonged, and brutal murder. As investigators pieced together the horrific scene inside the Rusk County trailer, their attention turned immediately to the only two adults present in the baby's life that night: 18-year-old Blaine Keith Milam and his girlfriend, 18-year-old Jesseca Carson, Amora's own mother. And what began as a vague story of leaving the child unattended quickly unraveled under the weight of mounting forensic evidence. Detectives noted that the couple's accounts shifted and conflicted, first claiming absence, then invoking a bizarre tale of demonic possession. But the physical evidence told a far more damning story. Among the dozens of injuries covering Amora's small body, investigators discovered clear bite marks, impressions so distinct that forensic analysis later matched them to Blaine Milam himself, placing him directly in the act of violence, while other signs at the scene, including disarray within the trailer and inconsistencies with the couple's statements, further undermined their desperate claims of a so-called exorcism. As the gravity of the evidence solidified, authorities moved swiftly, arresting both Milam and Carson on charges of capital murder, a charge that in Texas carries the ultimate punishment. And the mugshots that followed, Milam with a blank stare and Carson appearing hollow, almost detached, marked the beginning of a legal battle that would span over a decade. Even as the community struggled to comprehend how a mother and her partner could become the architects of such unimaginable cruelty against an innocent child. In 2010, nearly 2 years after the brutal killing of baby Amora, Blaine Keith Milam stood before a Texas jury charged with capital murder, and the courtroom became the stage for a chilling clash of narratives. Prosecutors, armed with gruesome autopsy photographs, forensic bite mark evidence, and testimony from investigators, painted Milam as a sadistic and remorseless killer who inflicted unspeakable suffering on a defenseless infant under the guise of an exorcism, while the defense countered with a portrait of a troubled teenager, arguing that Jesseca Carson, Amora's mother, was the driving force behind the ritual and bore greater responsibility, and further insisting that Milam himself lacked the mental capacity to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions, pointing to signs of intellectual limitations and impulsivity. Throughout the proceedings, witnesses described the scale of Amora's injuries in harrowing detail. Jurors wept as they heard about broken bones and bite marks, and the media splashed headlines about the Exorcism Murder across Texas, shocking the public and drawing national attention. But in the end, the jury was unmoved by pleas for mercy or doubt, returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. And with that decision, Blaine Milam was sentenced to death by lethal injection, his fate sealed even as years of appeals loomed ahead. while Jesseca Carson would later receive a life sentence without parole, leaving both forever bound to the crime that had stolen the life of a child. For more than a decade after his 2010 conviction, Blaine Keith Milam's case wound its way through the Texas and federal courts, with his attorneys launching appeal after appeal in a desperate effort to save him from the execution chamber, centering their arguments on several key points that cast doubt on the fairness of his trial. First, they challenged the heavy reliance on bite mark analysis, a forensic technique once considered solid, but later condemned by the scientific community as deeply unreliable and prone to error, raising the possibility that critical evidence used to convict Milam had been fundamentally flawed. Second, they argued that Milam himself was intellectually disabled, pointing to evidence of low IQ scores, impaired reasoning skills, and poor impulse control, which under the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decisions in Atkins v. Virginia and Moore v. Texas, would render his execution unconstitutional, as the law forbids putting to death individuals who cannot fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. And third, they claimed that Milam's trial lawyers had been ineffective, failing to adequately present mitigating evidence or challenge the narrative that he alone bore responsibility for Amora's death, when in fact they insisted Jesseca Carson was equally, if not more, culpable in orchestrating the so-called exorcism. Yet despite years of filings, hearings, and temporary stays of execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the federal courts consistently rejected these arguments, often in sharply worded opinions, declaring that while the crime was unspeakably horrific, the conviction and death sentence had been lawfully obtained and should stand. By early 2025, every appeal, writ, and motion had been denied. The U.S. Supreme Court had declined to intervene, and with no legal avenues left, Blaine Milam's path to execution was set in stone, his fate sealed by the same system that had once given his lawyers hope for reprieve. On Texas death row, Blaine Keith Milam lived in near-total isolation for almost 15 years, confined to a tiny cell in the Polunsky unit where the days bled into nights under fluorescent lights and the constant hum of prison life. And throughout that time, he became one of the youngest offenders awaiting execution in the state, his case drawing periodic attention as attorneys filed appeal after appeal. But as the date of September 25, 2025 approached, the urgency grew with disability rights advocates, faith leaders, and anti-death penalty activists rallying around his claim of intellectual disability, insisting that putting him to death would violate the Constitution and basic human decency, while legal filings stacked high in Austin and Washington, each carrying the hope of a reprieve, but one by one the courts rejected them, affirming that Milam's crime was too heinous and his guilt too clear to overturn. Inside his cell, Milam reportedly spent his final months reading the Bible, writing occasional letters, and clinging to the fragile hope that a last-minute stay might arrive. Yet as September wore on, that hope dwindled, and by the week of his scheduled execution, with clemency denied and the Supreme Court refusing to intervene, he was transferred from death row at the Polunsky unit to the Huntsville unit, the place where Texas carries out its executions. A grim journey that every condemned inmate takes when the countdown to their final hours begins. On the evening of September 25, 2025, after years of appeals, delays, and desperate pleas for clemency, Blaine Keith Milam was led from the holding cell at the Huntsville unit to the small, sterile execution chamber where countless men and women before him had taken their final breaths. And as the clock neared sunset, he was strapped onto the gurney, his arms extended outward, the bright fluorescent lights glaring above, while witnesses, including journalists, prison officials, and members of the victim's family, took their seats behind the glass to watch the state of Texas carry out its ultimate punishment. He declined to make a lengthy final statement, offering only a brief acknowledgement before closing his eyes, and at precisely 6:40 p.m., the warden gave the signal for the lethal injection to begin. The powerful drugs coursing through his veins as his chest rose sharply, and he let out a single audible gasp before slipping into what sounded like soft, rhythmic snoring, a common sign of the body surrendering under the sedative. Within minutes, the sound faded, His movements ceased entirely, and the room grew silent as medical staff checked for signs of life. At 6:48 p.m., Blaine Keith Milam was officially pronounced dead. His long and infamous journey from small-town East Texas to the state's death chamber finally at an end, marking yet another chapter in the state's history of executions and closing the book on one of the most disturbing cases of child murder in recent memory. For his final meal, Blaine Keith Milam did not receive any special request, as Texas had abolished the tradition of inmate-selected last meals in 2011 following a high-profile case, meaning that like every other condemned prisoner since, he was served only the standard prison tray offered that day, a stark reminder of the state's unyielding policy and the ordinary routine of an extraordinary moment. But in his last minutes on the gurney, with the 4 lines already in place and witnesses gathered behind the glass, he chose to speak, his voice steady and filled with conviction as he delivered what would be remembered as his final testimony of faith, declaring, "If any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again. I love you all. Bring me home. Jesus." Words that blended farewell, love, and an unshaken belief in redemption, echoing through the chamber as the lethal injection prepared to carry out its irreversible course. The story of Blaine Keith Milam is ultimately one of tragedy layered upon horror, a case where superstition, instability, and violence collided in the most unthinkable way as a young mother allowed herself to believe in demons. A vulnerable child was subjected to torture under the guise of an exorcism, and a man barely out of his teenage years spent nearly 15 years on Texas death row fighting to escape the punishment that awaited him. In the end, the truth that echoes most loudly is not about courtrooms, appeals, or even executions, but about the small and fragile life at the center of it all. Amora Bain Carson, a smiling baby who never had the chance to grow up, to laugh through childhood, or to step into a future of possibility. Her story, carved in grief and loss, is a haunting reminder of what is taken when violence replaces love, of how innocence can be stolen in an instant, and of how communities are left to grapple with questions of justice, faith, and forgiveness long after the prison gates have closed. As the images of Amora's bright eyes and innocent smile fade into memory, what remains is the enduring weight of her short life and the somber lesson that every act of violence leaves ripples far beyond the moment it occurs, touching not only victims and perpetrators, but entire families, towns, and, in cases like this, even the conscience of a nation. Thank you for watching this documentary on the tragic case of Blaine Keith Milam and the heartbreaking story of baby Amora Bain Carson. What are your thoughts on this case? Justice served, or a deeper failure of the system? Share your views in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to Crime Report Network for more in-depth stories on the cases that continue to shock and shape our world.